Hey guys, this is kind of a follow-up video to one I made a couple days ago about the news that Verizon was no longer partnering or signing the contract with Smith Micro. And I debated making this video because to me it kind of seems redundant for those who had seen the last video I made a couple days ago. However, there are a couple things that I've been seeing in the circles that I'm involved with that are just simply not true. Um, I tend to be very analytical, so it's difficult for me to assess when I need to comment versus when somebody's just speaking casually, right? Because nobody likes a jerk that's just overanalyzing and correcting somebody's statements when they're just kind of talking in a social sense. But when a situation like this happens, and there are young investors who are still developing their philosophies and they're impressionable, and they are looking to people who they view as authorities in these kinds of times, right? Being precise with language matters, at least for those who have a mind for these young investors. And by no means am I saying that I am, the guru on the mountaintop, or that I am, better than most people. I'm not. But that doesn't mean that I can't provide value in certain areas, and I think I can here. So the language that I've been seeing, I'll start with the first one, that kind of bugged me. There is a technical analyst who is being credited for predicting this black swan event. A black swan event, by definition, can't be predicted. A black swan event is something that is so unlikely to occur or is impossible to predict that when it happens, it tends to have significant adverse effects. But the bottom line is it really can't be predicted. If it can, it's not a black swan event, right? So that was kind of the first thing, right? Because it's giving undue credit to somebody who doesn't deserve it, in my opinion. Not because they aren't good at what they do. This person has some repute in the circles that I'm involved with, but either it's a black swan event or it's not. And if it is, he can't be credited. And if it isn't, that's a guy that people need to talk to. But I'm of the disposition that this is an unpredictable black swan event that occurred with Verizon. The second thing that I saw, or have been seeing, is is that these are the remaining carriers, AT&T and T-Mobile, have secured contracts with Smith Micro. That's the language that's used. And that seems to imply that there is a 0% chance that they will drop Smith Micro. And that's not true by any stretch of the imagination. I'm not saying that it's likely. For me personally, I would think of them as a black swan event too, if they dropped out. But it's all about properly and logically assessing risk, right? It was said to me not long ago when I was talking about going back to the drawing board and assessing the risks, right? Someone had told me, you can't put a mathematical percentage on this kind of risk that a carrier is going to drop out, right? And you can't put a percentage on that with any exactitude. So stop cluttering up the chat, and they wanted me to be quiet. That's the wrong way to think, right? Because it's not my position, and I would agree that you can't determine with a specific probability any particular event or risk occurring, right? That's not my position. However, you have to have an approximate value assigned to a risk. And it doesn't have to manifest as a percentage per se. You can say that this is a negligible risk, that this is a moderate risk, that this is a probable risk, and that's kind of a range of value percentages as a probability, right? And it's subjective. What may be marginal for me may be, if somebody else had a firm understanding of what I viewed as marginal, they might view it as moderate, right? And vice versa. But it is in error to say that one shouldn't talk about the risks just because there can't be a mathematical percentage applied to it. You have to look at those risks. If you don't and you ignore them, you're not investing right. You have to. And the pertinent risk here is, I believe it's bullet number 2 in the list of risks, page 2 on the annual, I think it is, for maintaining the carrier relationships, right? And we saw that, well, unfortunately, that was a risk that came to fruition. Many people, at first, characterized it as a black swan event. I wasn't entirely for sure. So, consider this. Even though we can't apply an exact percentage that a risk will manifest, for example, 30% chance that a risk will manifest, we may not be able to do that. However, we can say that on a scale, percentage-wise, from 0 to 100, it falls somewhere in there, right? Mind you, yes, I'm going to get a bit remedial, but this kind of systemic approach, by really thinking about the logic behind certain things, is important when you assess risk, so you can identify these kind of illogical statements, right? So it falls somewhere on that scale of 0 to 100. Between 0 and 100, we don't really know, right? But the unique numbers there is 0 and 100, because those numbers declare certainty, right? If you have 99%, there's a 1% chance it might not happen. So, there's the chance you could be wrong. But when you say 0 or 100%, you're saying you're not wrong. You can't be wrong. It's impossible, right? So those are unique in the sense that you can eliminate them fairly easily. And when people say that there's a secure contract with T-Mobile and AT&T, it strikes me that they are saying there's a 100% chance that they're going to stay. Or, alternatively, there's a 0% chance that they're going to leave. Well, let's think about that. I had spoken to experts in this particular field who tell me that it is standard for there to be termination provisions in these contracts. We could assume that it's probably in these contracts as well. But, let's say, well, you're not 100% certain about that, so it's possible, and, I'm not going to listen to you. Well, fine. You can repudiate a contract. That doesn't have to be written down. You can totally renege on your duties assigned by the contract. It's within the realm of possibility. And that's all you need to do to destroy the proposition that there's a 0% chance that the other carriers will leave. That's all you need to do. However unlikely that scenario is, because I'm not saying it's likely. I'm really not. However unlikely it is that a scenario occurs, if you can, within the bounds of possibility, not probability, but within the bounds of possibility, provide a scenario to where that risk manifests, it's not 0. Sorry. So the idea that these are secure contracts with the connotation that it's a sure thing, 100% sure going to happen, there's 0% chance they're going to leave, that's false. It's wrong. It is important for people to realize, I think, that it is possible that they leave. Now, I harp on that so much because I really don't want it to escape people's notice. But there's something else that you can do as well. Outside of 0 and 100%, you can work a little bit more in that range. A black swan event, for example, would be slightly above 0, but not very far. It's, however, so marginal and negligible that you can't predict it. It doesn't even factor into your evaluation of the company because it's so unpredictable. You can safely ignore a black swan event and its implications before it occurs, right? And that's important to recognize because there's a big difference between a black swan event and something that's very unlikely to occur, right? If something's very unlikely to occur, let's say a black swan event is a 1% probability. I think that's a bit high, but let's just say it's 1%. Something that's very unlikely might be a 5% chance or a 4% chance or a 7% chance, right? I think most people would say that's very unlikely to occur. Well, if it's not a black swan event and you can predict it, even if it's unlikely to occur, you need to account for that. You cannot ignore it. You cannot treat it like it's a black swan event, right? So the question is, was Verizon leaving truly, as best as we can tell, a black swan event? I wasn't so sure at first, because consider this. If a black swan event has a 1% probability of occurring, it stands to reason that me inappropriately assigning a weight to a risk is more likely than a black swan event occurring. Let's say that I'm really good at assigning weight to risk, and I only have a 5% chance of being off on the assignment of weight to a risk, however slight or however gross, right? There's a 5% chance, but 95% of the time I am exactly right on the general approximation of a risk coming to fruition. Even if I have that 5% chance of inappropriately weighting a risk, that's 5 times more likely than a black swan event occurring. And if someone were to reject that, just generally, don't get hung up on the percentages. I'm just using it to illustrate a point. But if someone were to reject that, they would in effect be saying it is as likely or more probable for a black swan event to occur than me to be wrong on weighing a risk. And that's hubris, I think. That's an untenable position. So, the point being, the first thing to be done when a black swan event occurs, or it looks like a black swan event, is to go back to the methodology. Look at how you assessed risk and look at the information that you now have available. If everything tracks and you cannot identify any substantial mistake that you made, that would kind of lead you to the conclusion, oh, I should have seen that coming, this isn't a black swan event. If you can't identify something like that, it indicates that it is indeed a black swan event. I came to the conclusion that it was, but I didn't go with that right away because it was more likely that I was wrong, right? So, running with the notion that this is a black swan event, I had initially stopped there. I was like, okay, it's a black swan event. We still got 2 carriers. It's, in my opinion, highly unlikely that they're going to leave. But there's also something else to consider, right? Black swan events, there's 2 possibilities with the occurrence of this black swan event. The first one, which is what most people, I think, have concluded, although I'm not sure they considered the other option, is that this is isolated, right? That Verizon leaving is a black swan event that has no bearing at all on any of the other carriers' likelihood of leaving, right? And that is certainly possible. And I do think that that is the correct interpretation. Now, however, I'd also considered the second possibility, and I think this is important for others to consider too. Suppose that this black swan event occurred, but it's not isolated. It is possible that there is, as a result of this black swan event occurring, some sort of unknown factor that affects the probability that T-Mobile and AT&T will renege on their contracts or pull out, right? Suppose for a moment, because we don't know what we don't know. Just run with that for a moment. Suppose that because of that increased probability, whatever that probability may be, but because it increased, it's elevated beyond some sort of black swan level, or it's characterized as within this black swan event, so it's singular. Suppose that T-Mobile leaves, right, as a result. Then you just have one. And we only need one for this to be a winner, right? There are two things that could happen under this second option, as I'm calling it. AT&T doesn't leave, right? Or AT&T also leaves. And then Smith Micro is left with no domestic, or at least no major domestic U.S. carriers. The one that remains will be able to profit from Smith's product immediately. And Smith will not be forced to sell their company. Some people have suggested that because Verizon pulled out, they wanted to get Smith Micro on the cheap and buy it out. But, right now Smith has two other carriers who are executing and generating, or soon to be generating, great profit for them. Why the hell would Smith sell right now? They wouldn't unless all three of them left. So AT&T would be, or whatever one carrier would be remaining under this scenario, would be incentivized to hold on to that contract, because while the other two are off developing their own product, and it will take God knows how long in that kind of scenario for them to do that, they're locking down the market and they're making money. They're reducing churn and getting that kind of market gain from the others by providing a service that people want, right? That would be the sensible thing to do. And I think that's the worst case scenario, right? I don't view it as likely. I think we're most likely going to retain these two carriers, and possibly Verizon comes back, but I don't care. I'm not worrying about that. But suppose that the worst happens. All of them leave. Right? Well, what happens in that case? In that case, you've got Smith Micro dead in the water. But all three carriers are developing their product or doing whatever with it. I'm going to assume that they're developing products. They could just do nothing with it, but I think that's almost certainly not the case. The thought's going to occur to one of them, and people have already surmised this about Verizon, that, hey, why not just buy Smith Micro? Instead of taking God knows how long to develop my own product that may or may not work out, I like Smith, so I'm going to buy him, right? And then suppose Verizon lowballs them, right? These other two carriers, they're going to be like, hey, that's going to hurt our business. They're going to get Smith Micro, they're going to get their stuff on the market, and we're going to be at a competitive disadvantage. We're not going to allow that. We're going to bid too. And then it turns into a bidding war. The point being is that even in death, if all the carriers leave, Smith Micro still has value, and they'll find themselves in a bidding war. Again, there's so many other scenarios that can happen well before that, and I don't think that's going to happen. But the absolute worst case scenario, the way I see it, is a bidding war for the corpse of Smith Micro. And that can still generate good returns. They don't have debt. They're a valuable business. So I think it's kind of silly when I see language, saying that Smith Micro needs to file for bankruptcy. They don't have debt. They'd sell their company first, but it's ridiculous. This is the most unlikely event, and there's still value in it, right? But there's a lot of things that have to go wrong in order for that to come true, right? You have to have two carriers drop out, which are either two more carriers drop out, which are black swan events of themselves, or even if there's some hidden correlation that increases the likelihood that the others will drop out. One might drop out, but it'd be foolish for the last one to drop out. Just by staying in not developing their own product, not putting any extra work in. They're making money and denying their competitors a business advantage. And then even if you ignore that and you say all three of them are going to pull out, I still see a bidding war. So it really, the logic that I'm seeing is lacking in people's language. And I understand some of them may be thinking casually, but I don't want people to be led astray, particularly for younger investors who are seeing others say that it's not worth thinking about, the possibility that these other two fall off, it's a black swan event. You have to think about these and make your own conclusions. It would have been very easy for me to write this off immediately as a black swan event. It would, at least in my own mind, protect my investment by shielding myself from potential negative things. No, you gotta protect it by thinking about these things and rendering your own conclusions. And I'll say, again, briefly, to recap. First, there is a non-zero possibility that the other two carriers leave. It is, in my opinion, incredibly small, black swan event worthy, and that's a good thing because one is wildly improbable. Having three, it's absurd to even consider. But it is possible. And recognizing possibility is the best way I think people can protect themselves. And to systemically apply this kind of logic and say that there's a possibility, to even just recognize that there's a non-zero possibility, is leaps and bounds ahead of the logical skills that I've seen some employ, or at least they connote or imply. The business case for Smith Micro is still valid. And I will say that I wasn't very happy at the news. I was actually upset. And I took that emotional response and I used it to drive an investigation to find something wrong with this. Because, at that particular time, I wanted out. I'm sick of Smith Micro, in a sense. So I was looking for something, right? And that's the best kind of diligence that you can do. Not to prove yourself right, but to really and earnestly try to prove yourself wrong. That is the best kind of investigation you can do for your own diligence and reviewing your methodology. And despite that, I still came to a very, very, very strong conclusion, or a conclusion I feel very, very strongly about, that it's still worth it. It really is. It sucks. There is no sugarcoating that, and you've got people dancing around, like doing their victory laps. And that's fine. That's fine. It's something that you have to disregard, because if you let people in their victory laps get to you, it has the ability to mess you up. And that's what I really don't want to see others do, particularly younger or developing investors. I don't want to see them be misled by the people who are trolling right now and doing their victory laps, and also other people who are attempting, and I suspect, to shield themselves a bit by negating all possibilities that this could go wrong. And it could. You can't have those blinders on you. You got to have eyes wide open. And yeah, it may seem ridiculous to some. I realize that, to focus so much on 0 and 100% and try to knock out, those two things, because it's just one number in a huge range. But it deals with possibilities. Non-zero and something other than 100 establishes more than one possibility. And that's the kind of things that you have to account for when you are analyzing an investment and trying to accurately account for risks, establishing possibilities. And then you can establish or seek to establish probabilities or approximations of probabilities. But yeah, I just wanted to make this follow-up video to encourage particularly developing investors not to have those blinders on, to do your due diligence and don't seek to prove yourself right. It's better to seek to prove yourself wrong. Don't jump to conclusions. And if something like this happens, really dig into how your methodology led you to this conclusion and see if you can find a kink in the armor. And if there is, explore it. But yeah, don't sit with your hands off the steering wheel, especially when something like this happens. And be careful about who you listen to and how they're wording things. So yeah, if there's any questions or anything, if you've got a comment on this, I'll be more than happy to answer whatever you've got. Yeah, have a good one.